Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest DBmaestro Academy webinar, Git-Driven Database CI with Jenkins and DBmaestro, hosted by our favorite one and only Brady Byrd, and joined today by our CTO and co-founder, Yaniv Yehuda. Brady and Yaniv, take it away.
Thank you, Ben.
Hey, Brady. Good
Hello,
day.
how are you doing, Yaniv?
Perfect. Thank you.
We are across the pond, not quite in the same room. So we're just a little housekeeping stuff to start off. Everybody's in mute mode now. If you have questions, you can put them in the questions section there, and we'll try to deal with them sort of in line, but then also in a period at the end. And then we're recording this so that if you need to get a copy of it later, we'll have it available on the DBmaestro website. And so here are our smiling faces. Now you know exactly, who's talking. Git, boy, if it hasn't been a household word in the last year, I remember, I think 10 years ago, 12 years ago, using Git and having people very suspicious of it, like, what are you doing with that? And why would you bring that into our corporate environment? And now it's just an avalanche of everybody is moving to it. And there's some good reasons. So Git is a distributed source control system. And so I'm going to start off, and I hope I'm not too pedantic for those around who really know the stuff, that I'm going to describe a little bit about how Git works. But then we're going to lay it out and say, okay, if you've got these events in Git, how do they relate to events in the development deployment process? And then I'll go into some scenarios, and here I'm describing a little bit about what we'll see in the scenarios, but each scenario is designed around a way in which Git could interact with the source code that we're using to deploy to our database. So with that, I can jump into my lovely picture slide. We have a shortage of words in the world, especially English words. And so what happens here is that they come up with ways of describing things. So in Git, you have branches and forks. Think about it. So typically anybody who's worked with some of the source control systems going way back to CVS and stuff is familiar with the concept of a branch. A branch is a way of taking a copy of the code and being able to work on it separately, and then later merge that back into the original so that you can have like separate features or separate versions of it out there in simultaneously, and then interact between those two different branches. But branches occur in the same repository. What Git gives you the ability to do is fork a repository. And with a fork, it works like a branch. You're taking a copy of that repository, but you're pulling it into another repository, which means you can have separate users, separate permissions, and in the open source community, what happens is that, and it's very common to see if you get some of these programming tools, somebody built this programming tool, and then somebody made a fork of it, and then the people who made the fork actually made the better tool eventually, and now you've got a sign up on the original guy's GitHub that says, hey, if you really want the latest, go to where the fork is, because they're the ones who have it. On the other side of it, when you have a fork that separates off, you can issue a pull request and say, hey, I think I've done something really cool over here. You, owner of this code, would you like to pull my changes back in? And so now in the corporate world, with things like Bitbucket, which is Git under the hood, and GitLab and things like that, these forks become different teams and different working groups inside a company, and then you have that formal process of a pull request to work with. So think about where a fork fits in, think about where a branch fits in, but you'll hear these type of words as they go on. But this is all about distributed source control, and that's been the real magic of Git. Yaniv, you might remember working back with Subversion or
Yeah,
even Clear Case,
yeah,
and remember what it was to make a commit?
yeah. I was actually about to ask you this because this is drastically different than anything that anybody looking back into source control is used to. One repository, it's clear who's checking in and checking out. It's a very clear token and a process kind of perspective. And here, like, everybody's doing their own stuff, several repositories, all like in different states, people pulling and pushing changes. So how would that compare to, I don't know, you said ClearCase, that's way back, but SVN, Perforce, I don't know, the more modern ones, maybe TFS, if you look at it for a couple of years ago before it added Git as an engine.
Yeah.
So how does that compare?
So the big difference here, and the reason so many developers prefer the distributed systems, is that when you work with Git, there's the central repository, but then what you can do is clone that repository. When you clone that repository, you get the whole darn thing. You get all the commits and all the history and everything like that. But now it's local to your machine. So you're working on your machine, and you get to say, okay, I'm gonna actually, it's better to talk about it contrasting. In the old days, when we used to drive our horses to our repository, the when you went to make a commit, that commit went into the central repository. And when you did that, everybody else suddenly got what you were working on, right? And maybe it wasn't fully baked, maybe it wasn't all the way there, but you wanted to save that, right? You wanted to make sure it was committed. With Git, now you have a local copy. Now you can say, oh, I just changed this one file, fine, commit that, and make a little note about it. Or maybe you can run down some rabbit hole of saying, well, what if I did it this way and that way and all? So you commit before you do that, then you run that change and you see if you can do it. And then, oh, that didn't work. So now you reset head, you're back to where you were. All of
So
that
you can
stuff can be
experiment.
done locally.
You can experiment. You can try more liberally to work with stuff. But Brady, something doesn't connect to me here. So you talk about like local repositories and a lot of copies, but we are talking also about database changes. Database don't have like distributed engines and local repositories. There's the database. You might create several copies of it. So how would that relate? How would that process work?
That's exactly right, Yaniv. It is there is a translation layer that has to come in here. Databases are stateful. Databases are cumulative. Databases have sometimes very high consequences for undo and rip and replace and things like that. So what we're going to end up working with here is two sides of the database. One side is migration scripts. Migration scripts are what you use to change the database. But there's a big difference here because if you think about source code, I'm going to write a little, module in source code. That module doesn't change, right? I write that, that's what it is. There's only one thing. In the database, there's two sides of it, right? There is the migration that says add a column, and then there is the state that says I'm a table with 7 columns. So being able to know how one affects the other and being able to track all those changes in Git is what I'm going to show you a bit about. But thanks for reminding me to get that translation layer in there. So if we look at some of the events that go on here, right? If you're used to building code, you're going to code some changes and this and that, and then you're going to do a build. And if you're in the advanced world of CI, I'm saying that sort of tongue in cheek, but you never know. And that coding change is going to result in some sort of a build. Then you might push it to some early environment so you could do a little bit of unit testing, and then eventually you might promote that into a shared environment. And then eventually you'd release it out into production. And so in the traditional world, right, we have our build, right? We did a build that took my code to something that could be run. We have like approvals and sign-offs, that go in. In terms of release, you might have tickets and change processes and stuff like that. But then on the top here, I have some events in Git. And so since this is all about the ability to automate things, if we can associate common events in Git with these transitions in the development and deployment process, then we have a nice way to automate things. So I'm just going to take a little water.
That's high level. Can we take it more to a practical level? Let's see how we can actually use that in a flow, in a pipeline.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So what I've got here is a couple of scenarios, and I'm going to start with what I think is sort of the basic use case here, and I would presume that folks listening in have probably been through one or two releases. I've certainly been through a few myself. Yaniv, I think you can remember the glory of typing arguments at high speed in a production environment.
Yeah, you don't want to do that. Anything for me, anything longer than 6 characters is error prone. I better not do it. Better automate whatever I can.
That's right. So this common habit of fat fingering an argument or something, and especially, like I said, there's a shortage of words. It's entirely possible that your misspelling of one thing could actually be some other real thing that gets enacted instead. So if you can get the arguments and the inputs to a deployment to be predefined, then you've just added a little bit of safety to your process. But one thing about this is that it's what we call opinionated, right? And I like that people are bringing this term into operation now. And what that means is that it's not actually, you could do it any number of 16 ways. There's actually one way to do it, and we've designed automation around that one way to do it. And in this case, I created a way of formatting a commit message, and that commit message has some keywords in it here. I've got tasks, : I've got version, : and then something there. And this gives me the ability to use automation to pluck those things out. So let's see how that works in a live environment.
Yeah, Brady, you know what's the best thing about it, in my opinion? It's repeatable. You design it one time, and you play it back, and there's no like different ways to achieve the goal. There's one way, the way you designed it, tested it, and keep testing it. And if something comes up, you just improve the process and never go back. So it's an ever improving process. That's what I like about it.
Absolutely, and I think people. In the beginning, you start off doing something and you got a couple of these, a couple of those, and it seems pretty easy to stare at a directory and make sense of it. But it takes a little forethought to say, okay, well, how will this look 18 months from now when I have 2,700 scripts that have been executed, over the last year and a half, and I'd like to know which ones were executed against a production environment. Those type of things get overwhelming quickly. So, and you start off with the whole KISS methodology, and you keep it simple, and conventions really help with that. So what I've got in this scenario, first let me describe a little bit about the environment here. I've got a number of databases here representing they're all sitting in here, representing different environments in there. And like I said, you can't have branches of a database. So in this case, each branch represents an environment. And if we go to DBmaestro here, I've got a project. I'll go into that project. We've got these environments. I've got development environment. I've got an introductory environment, DIT here, couple of QAs, staging, and production. Each one of these represents a database underneath of it. But they're all the same application, so they all should be somewhat the same, or at least on the same timeline. So Now what I'm going to do is introduce a change into that. And for that, I'm going to use automation in Jenkins. I have a pipeline here, and I'm going to run this pipeline to deploy my changes out. Now, it does involve Git, so let's go back to Git. So I've got here in Git, let me get my right one. Yep, here's my repository. Let me see if I have any changes spooled up. Git status. Yep, there's a change in there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say git commit -a -m. And then I'm going to put my thing here. And so what I've got is my formatted message. I'm going to put that little version colon, and then I'm going to go find exactly what I'm looking for here, which is the version I want to deploy, which is 351 review templates.
So this is the tagging or the templates and the structure of that you design around it. So if this is the best practice, this is how you want everybody to deploy changes, and that's how you set up the product.
Exactly. So I'm asking people to put in this. Yeah, you're right. And you don't have to spell adding right, but you do have to have version colon in there. And the other thing is that there may be commits that you don't want to have deployed. By having a formatted commit message, it's easy to pick through what's there and decide what's ready to be deployed. So now I've got that in there. And so I can now go to my Jenkins job and just run it. So if I go in here, do my build, and let's see how the automation grabs things. So here it went through. Here's my what my commit message said. It was able to pluck that out of here. It uses that to go off and find this folder in here. So it found this folder named 351 review templates, grabbed the scripts out of it, and then took those scripts, asked DBmaestro to package them up, and then it asked DBmaestro to go ahead and deploy it. So in the sort of look now, no hands category, we just did a database deployment without doing any runtime inputs. We just said go.
But how do I know where this went and if it's successful and is it deployed already? So
let's
how
see.
do I get that in?
Deployed. So yep, it's here. It says 351 here. I can go into this and look at my my deployment history. So here it is, a successful one, 351 review templates. If I look at the details, DBmaestro does capture all this stuff here. So I can look in here and see what it has. It says, let's see, here's all the stuff from Oracle, enter password, table altered. So that looks like it's an alter. Let's see what's down here. This is going to be table created, I presume, somewhere in here. Yep, table created. There it is. So I can see that it all got done. DBmaestro captured it all.
So Brady, a couple of questions here. So I was about to ask you, and then I picked up the questions that people asked and saw the same question coming up like from the audience. So how is this connected? So you had a Git branch, but you have a database schema. So how is that connected? How is that related? And also you said automated, but actually you went there and you said Jenkins go. So can you actually do it no hands at all?
I think we can get there. We can get there. So the relationship here is that in my automation, it's reaching out and you can see here we've got Jenkins is making sure it refreshes things. So this is pulling all of my repository information, getting the fresh stuff. And then what I've got here is I go in to that path, and I look for the file. I look for the what's in there. So it's going in here, and it's saying, git log -1, and it gets the last commit, and it reads this off of it, and then it uses that to traverse the file system to find that folder and pluck out those files.
Yeah.
So that gets it. But you're right. I did have to go and manually run this job. Well, what if we wanted to do it a little more automated than that? So that might be what we call an on-commit trigger. So now an on-commit trigger, it's just going to do it, right? You're like, I'm done, but it's going to do it for you. So you got to be pretty sure you're ready to do it. So some of the factors in that, right, is you want to know when to deploy or when not to deploy. You want to have some maybe secondary signal in there for that. You got to have some way of knowing which files to deploy, and then once again, we've got this commit, we've got an event we can work with. So I did this one really, as sort of bare bones as I could. So what I've got in here is I've got my repository, and this is this multi-branch repository. Let's see what the state of it is here. So I need to, it's all clean right now. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to add a new file to deploy. So I'm just going to be a developer here. And so what I'm going to say here is I'm going to have a new column called land area. And I'll just make it a simple number. And so now I've got that. Let me go ahead and save that. Call it add land area. So now I have a new script file to run. Over here. When I look at status again, here's my.
It's actually not part of the project yet, right?
Yeah, that's right. So in Git, you got to tell it, go ahead and be part of the project. So let me put our paste in there. And now what I'm going to do is commit that.
Commit or push? What would actually trigger the action here, and how much control do you have over it?
So in Git, and thank you, I had realized that that's probably something we want to take a look at. So if I go in here and I go into my repository, there's always a little hidden Git folder in there. And Git has this concept of hooks, just like I showed you. Well, actually, I'm going to show you in a second. But what this does is there's a file for every event. So I'm taking this post commit here, and I'm doctoring that. So I say, when you have a commit, run this script, git hook receiver. And so I wrote a little, well, this actually calls yet another file, because I don't like working in batch. So this calls a groovy file. But then that groovy file deals with the incoming information. So let's see what happens when I commit here. So let's see, I'm going to say adding land area. And then I put a little trigger in here, db deploy. So basically, unless you say db deploy, it's going to ignore it. So like here, if I spell it wrong, right? db deploys, well, let's see, db deploys. So now I got this in there. So now the hook fires, but then it says it didn't contain db deploy.
Yep.
So,
but this is something that you just decided you want as a template. It could be anything else.
Yeah. So now, I just realized I got myself in trouble, because now the file won't be new. So let's get in here. So let me.
I'll just create another one.
Hit RM, and then I'll paste it again. and then I'll re-enter my commit. Okay, now what I'm going to do is add it again. Oh, sorry. Let me save this. Okay. There we go. Now let's go back and spell our commit message right. Okay. So now it went through, right? And this is the magic here, right? Git diff. So it did a diff, and then it rolled forward. It did a diff and found this changed file. So now that I know that file, I know that's what's ready to be deployed. Once again, I toss it into a folder for DBmaestro to pick up and enter this packaging command for DBmaestro, and then it puts it through the packaging, and then eventually, if it finishes here, it should go off and perform the rate. So let's see what's happening now. This is a different project.
So actually what you did here is an automated CI process. So the moment you decide your change is done, it was automatically deployed to the database.
That's right. And so now it's here. And if this is sort of a low consequence database, then we can do that. But there are some factors, like what would happen, you know, if I just deployed it and completely hosed down the main system integration.
Yeah. So what happens if you have a syntax error, a dependencies error? I don't know. You do something wrong, and now you deployed it to integration environment, and suddenly 30, 40 developers are trying to figure out why their application is not running, and they can't debug and can't move forward. So, like, you know, when I talk to people, this is part of the reason they hesitate to do automation for the database, because it's high risk for any failure. You break something, then you know it might take some time to revive it, to fix it, and everybody might be like stuck and can't go forward doing their job.
That's actually a really good point, and there's technically nothing in Git that's going to save you from that. Git is a fantastic way to organize and move files, to be able to understand version and stuff in text files. The database itself, you know, has an engine, has a metadata configuration, has data that depends on that metadata configuration. There's a whole lot more complexity under the hood than that. And one of the things I'm able to demonstrate all this automation and all these things happening here because on the back end, I have a tool that's going to provide a safety envelope for this process. So if we think about what's happening, like in this human resources pipeline, and if we look at what that deployment we did, right? I just, you know, my automation went and did a, you know, did all these things, but in the end, it just said, "Hey, DBmaestro, go do this," right? That's what it said in one line. But what DBmaestro did for me was make that a safe process. So if we look at what happened here under the hood, we had in here, there was what we call a pre-run environment. Actually, even before the pre-run environment, there's a policy. So a whole bunch of static code rules got applied to this, and it looked at it and it said, hey, are you dropping tables? Are you dropping columns? Are you deploying to production in the daytime? If you're creating a new table, did you name it with TBL underscore? And all of these things in there that got run on that script to make sure it was safe to execute. But then to take it one step further, there's a scratch environment in there. It's called the pre-run environment. It's not even part of the pipeline. It's just a replicate of that initial environment. And we ran the script there first to see if it was okay, right? If that script had encountered an error, or if I had written something wrong and deleted a whole bunch of records, it wouldn't have affected anything, because it would have just hit the scratch environment. You would have gotten that report, the job would have failed, and then you would have been informed by DBmaestro that the job that the process didn't work.
Yeah. So if potentially, let's say you have a long collection of scripts, one of them is dropping a table, another one is doing some action, and another one is creating a new table but creating it wrong, and then maybe you get an error from the database. So in a classic CI process, you're actually getting that information fed back to you in a very short feedback loop. So a minute or two after you check in your changes, you push your changes in or commit them, you get a message saying, well, your code is not good, it's not well written, or it fails in the database, and you can just change it and run it again, and that table you dropped is still there because it's still in the real environment, and you can just retry your process till it's good.
Exactly. And if I'm a developer and I've just entered my git command, all of that information was piped right back to you from where you entered the command. DBmaestro told you exactly what was happening, what it did. It would say right here, policy violation. It would say, all of that stuff. You get that feedback immediately as a developer, and without having to go hopping between systems. So it is, that was a great point to make there, Yaniv, that one of the things that helps with automation, obviously, if you automated everything around a very simplistic idea of what to do, then you still set yourself up for a lot of failure. Whereas if you automate your way into something like a tool that takes care of a lot of those details, like DBmaestro in this case, then you've got a lot higher chance of success and a lot higher chance of having automation and adoption go hand in hand. Lots of beautiful automation has been written that never got adopted for whatever reason, whether it was advertising or, a flawed person selling it or, something on the back end. You could say that is the trail of tears for database scripts, because people write these database scripts with earnest intentions and everything like that, but the database platform is rather unforgiving when a script hits it. And so it's nice to have something that can buffer that and give you a little safety layer.
Yeah. So,
but you can get to that place where you get fully triggered deployment, just like this in Git. I'm just going to take a glance at these questions because they're probably.
No, I took a glance. We actually answered.
Okay, great. So I have yet another scenario here. So we've seen now Git can trigger things, but what I wanted to do was think about a little bit about working on a team. So, and this is where things get complicated, and this is where I'm going to pull in also the underlying state of the database. So we're going to have both the migration script that drives it, and the result that migration script makes on the state of the database. So I'm going to use multiple branches in this case to work with stuff, and in that case, I've got these branches acting like different teams in early environments, and then the idea of using conflicts as a predictive measure of what's going to happen in the database, what's going to happen in the merge. You don't want to find out you've overwritten 22 methods in somebody's 1,000-line package after they're gone. You want to find out before they disappear. So let's see a little bit about how that works. So if I go here into my my world, let's see, I'll start here in DBmaestro. So what I've got is a couple of pipelines. I've got two different projects, Project A and Project B, cleverly named. And then I've got this merge one, and merge represents where you come into UAT and then make your way over into production. So the idea here is that we have two different teams working on, two different, maybe this is the January release and this is the March release or something, and they're working on two different things, but they kind of have to know about what's going on with each other before they run this thing out into production.
Yeah. To make sure a bug fix doesn't conflict with a new feature or the other way around.
Exactly. And so the way I've represented this in Jenkins is I've got a multi-branch pipeline. Now this is a great feature of Jenkins. What it does is it goes in, you point it at a Git repository, it takes apart the branches of that Git repository, then it looks for a special Jenkins automation file called a Jenkins file in each of those repositories, and if it finds one, it declares it a deployable entity. So these are completely code-driven objects in Jenkins based in Git. I've got a Jenkins file in Groovy in Git, and that Groovy script determines what happens in this pipeline. And then I'm using a rather sophisticated feature on DBmaestro as well. Whenever we go and deploy in DBmaestro, I'm using version of hooks. And so what a DBmaestro hook does is it traps an event, in this case, a successful deployment event, and it pipes it out to a script. So I've got a script here that's going to run that. And what I've done with that script is I pump all this stuff into GitHub. So now if I go into GitHub, I've got my branches here. Here's project A, here's project.
Let me get that, Brady. So it's not one-way connection. It's like a bidirectional connection. So you get changes flowing from Git or Bitbucket or whatever into DBmaestro to execute them, but then everything is driven back into Git, so you can do what?
It's full circle, exactly. So now let's suppose I'm working on project B, and I have my GitHub account here, and I can go in, I can say, hey, what's happening on project A? What are they working on? What's going on here? And so I can go in and say, okay, well, here's where the project A stuff is. Here's what they're looking at. I can say, what is it, what happened? What did they touch most recently? And I can say, okay, they're working on the locations table. Rats, I'm also working on the locations table. That's a problem. Let me see what's going on with this. So now I'm going to go here. Let me get back to my to the right repository here. So now if I just say, if I look at project A, I'm in project B right now, and I just say, tell me about project A, then it looks through and it says, oh, look, here's a stored procedure that has some differences. And then, but hey, I'm not working on that stored procedure, so I don't care. But now if I go here, here's my locations table. Look, I've added columns to locations and so have they. This is a potential problem. But now using Git and branches, I have predicted that problem before we go mess up UAT.
Yeah.
So this is really, really cool stuff, in the way that Git works. If you can, in using your automation tools, if you can pipe it all around, right? So I've got this ability to go in and say, with DBmaestro and say, okay, after I'm done, go ahead and do this. That synchronizes right back to Git and brings those changes. And that's possible because DBmaestro is watching what happens underneath all of this. So when this thing goes, it creates a file. Let's take a look at what we have in here. Let me go into project A. Actually, let me go ahead and run something here. So if I go in, let's see, automation, repo, deploy. So what am I on here? I'm on 006 urban population. So if I go here, I've got the next one. So let's see here. My next one is going to be 007 building locations. Okay, so I'm just going to run this manually without a job associated. So let's create a package. I'm going to call it v0.0.7. And now let me get that file, which is over in automation, repo, deploy.
So you're semi-manually running the automation. So you just
Yeah. Well, it kind of shows you what the automation does here. So now I've got my my script. I'll drop it in place.
You have the release package.
Yep. So now I've got a script to do here, and I'm going to go ahead and run it. And here's my package, number 7, available. And so let's see what's happening here. So we've got, here's the policy, here's running the script, and let's see what happens further here. Here's that hook firing. Let's see what the hook did. So with an extremely small font for everybody who has magic eyes, what's happening here, right? The hook fired. It saw the script that I ran, and this is all information that DBmaestro passes to a hook. It gives it a big fat JSON file with everything that's going on. So you have everything there. And now what I've done is I've gone and updated the model for that locations table where that column was added. And now you can see I'm pushing it into Git and make a checkout. And because my virtual machine didn't have a username, it never made it to GitHub, but we can see it locally. So there's that hook in DBmaestro firing. So now when I go back to my repository here, I can look at stuff, and sorry, I just switched to Project A. Yes, so here's my latest one, version 007. My little hook put it in there and fixed that. And now if I just look at what I have in, if I do my same diff again, except this time I'm going to diff for Project B because I'm in Project A. Is everybody, am I confusing people with jumping around branches? Because one of the things with Git is that when I do some command like this, when I say, you know, and I didn't even have to do it, the automation did it behind the scenes for me. But when I change branch, literally like all the files, thousands of files could change underneath me. So even though I haven't changed any directories or anything like that, I switched into a completely different world by coming out of Project B and into Project A. But now I'm going to diff Project B again and see what happened. So we looked at the same thing with the stored procedure, but now we've got a new one in here called has alternate reality, or was it building? Which one was it? Let's see, it said in here what I did before.
You can actually see that in DBmaestro as well.
Yeah. So version 007, I didn't give it a friendly name. But either way, I had 5 differences before, and now I have 6. Yeah. So it's showing me essentially in real time, right? As people are doing deployment work, it's updating the state model of the database and making that available for anybody else to see. So if I'm working on a different project, it's not a big information request or a meeting where everybody's scheduling all those times. I just go in and say git diff, and I know. exactly what they're working on and why it could become a problem.
Yeah, yeah. So Brady, let's try zooming out and recapping like the overview of this. We started with Git, with a local repository. You pushed it, you committed and pushed changes. DBmaestro was triggered either manually or automatically, pushed them to the database according to predefined templates and environments.
That's
But
right.
before it actually pushed the changes, it validated that, we didn't talk about roles, but you can actually have the right role to, and the ability to push changes to that environment. You don't do something that is a counter organizational policy, so you don't try to maybe drop or rename a table or do some grants that are not supposed to happen.
Right, the policy engine was executed on it.
Yeah, then you dry run the code to make sure that you don't break the actual database, and if you have syntax error or any kind of errors, you get it back to the developer without breaking the database. But if everything goes right, only then you actually deploy to the database.
That's correct. So you can see here, it takes a step where it synchronizes that pre-environment with my initial release source environment. Then it's able to run the script on the pre-run. Having succeeded there, it does a special unlocking of that initial environment, runs all the scripts, and then it goes into what we call a discovery phase here, where it says, oh, look, there was some things added, some things changed. DBmaestro is going to document all that so that you know where you started, you know where you ended, and we did a pre-check before you began to ensure that everything was going to come off safely.
Yep. Yeah. So before we wrap up and ask and let people ask questions and maybe do a quick poll, can you show things maybe from the DBmaestro perspective? Let's say go to an environment and see what's actually deployed there. Can you actually see that?
Yeah. So if I go into my release source environment here, I can look at it. If I go to deployed packages, it shows me the history of this environment, shows me who did it and when. It's all there. And if I want to see what happened, it's all live drill down. So I can just say, oh, what does urban population look like? Well, here's the package for urban population. What's in that script? Oh, here's the script.
Okay, so you have a full audit. You have a full audit for each database, in addition to the automation, the safety nets, and all the things that we just discussed.
Yeah. So this added building. So that was the question I couldn't answer before. Was it, well, what it did there? It added building. So if I look here, it's showing me building as a difference between the two branches now.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's and that's choosing your tools wisely, right? I'm right now I'm Mr. Automation Head, right? So I'm writing Groovy and I'm working with Jenkins and I've got my Git and everything like that. But what I'm hitting on the back end, which I in fact never even have to look at while I go through the process, except here to show you all, DBmaestro is taking care of all of that and documenting every step of the way exactly what got touched and what got done, so that I'm free to work in just automation terms.
Perfect. Great. I think that was clear, very clear. So maybe we do a short poll before moving to the Q&A session.
Yeah, let me see here. We have a poll. So there should be a polling thing that'll come up on your screen. Any information requests you all have, we'll leave a few seconds here to complete that.
Yeah, anybody who wants some more background information, best practices, things that are you should consider, and even we do a lot of surveys, and we're actually planning to release the 2019 DevOps survey pretty soon. I think it's even actually planned for the next webinar that we're planning. If you want to get like information or any of these white papers, just click on either of the options. I see people voting there. Let's give them a few more seconds and move forward.
I'm just reading questions.
If anybody have any additional questions to the one that were already asked, just type them in the chat box. We'll be able to see them and address them. People are still voting, so we would keep this open for a few more seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
I think the Git flag should be a fork and a branch. They'll fly. Well, now it's all Microsoft, but either way, you can tell why Microsoft spent the money on Git, because
Yep.
really they've got the stuff. So thank you on the poll there, and to look at some of these questions here. It says the commit itself triggers DBmaestro or the push to the main trunk. That's a good question, and it goes back to those different events here. So in Git, you can trap any number of events. So there's a pre-push one. I don't think all events are in here. They got some stuff there. But you can trap a push or as a post push and work with that. In this case, I chose commit, but either way, it's just a script that gets run. So I could copy the text out of this and put it in a file named post push, and that's what would get executed on push. For a pull request or a fork, that automation will be run from your GitLab or your GitHub side, where they can trap those events. And Jenkins is very sophisticated on that too, that it can interact with your local Git repository, or it can interact directly with GitHub on the back end.
So potentially you could use all of these tools together in synergy. So when you do maybe a pull, you could trigger DBmaestro to refresh your database and make sure it's up to date.
That's right. So each branch in the database is represented as a schema. That is absolutely correct. And databases, you never know, that they'll get there maybe one day with the idea of branches. Oracle has the concept of additions, but they don't apply to the complex objects like tables. So for right now, we're stuck with creating a separate database to represent, or a separate schema to represent each branch of development. There are other tools out there like Delphix and Actifio, which can, in a very short order, swap a database in for another one, and they do it from essentially a compressed backup copy, but then they basically don't copy the entire database. It uses a delta method to present to present it to the backend platform. What that would enable you to do is actually, quote, switch branches. So without incurring more licensing expense on your database, Delphix can swap in, what would represent project B compared to project A, so that you'd be able to attach to it with the same connection string. So that's pretty slick. You can get towards that, but in the meantime, right? What we're doing here in the way we've married all of this is you get the best of both worlds, that you get to think about a multi-branch scenario as far as database code goes, but all of your actions take place on real databases.
Yeah, so you can actually test your releases. I think this is the most important thing, because the biggest problem is as we said, repeatability. And if you have your code tested in one environment and then you make sure that it goes to the next environment and there's no configuration drift, and anything that would pose a potential risk would be highlighted well in advance, then you eliminated a big portion of the risks of database potential downtime.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, we're running awfully close on time here.
Yeah,
There was a question about rollback, and rollback is good to consider. I know people spend a lot of time writing rollback scripts and everything like that. In the case of DBmaestro, it will calculate what's necessary for a rollback for you in the event of an error. So you can build that script dynamically rather than writing hundreds of rollback scripts up front, of which you never end up using any of them. So rollback is an important business process to support. The way in which you support it may require more or less effort. We try to keep it on the less effort side here. Data ops, that's a neat thing. I've been interested in that subject lately. With regard to DBmaestro, we and all of its sort of back-end processing, we're watching the structure of the database. However, with regard to working with your scripts and things that address the data ops problems, all that work should also be run through DBmaestro, because of the package and script management and the output control and all of those pieces. And the same sort of automation you're seeing here could work with your data ops piece. But it's a really neat science too, the analytical side of that.
Yeah, it's definitely part of that data ops realm, and it does connect very tightly to DevOps. It's all about best practices, safety nets, the ability to control what's happening. Yeah, to make sure that you can actually run fast, but with much less risk and better auditing and accountability to what happens. And as soon as you construct a well repeatable automated process, you're not just saving time, and you're working in a better way. You can find out what's when something went wrong and how it did and happened, and it's easier.
So let me go ahead and let Ben say a couple of closing remarks. But if anyone wants to sit on, we'll go ahead and run through the questions. But we want to be respectful that we've taken up our hour. So Ben, you want to give the closeout? But anyone who wants to hang on, I'll happily. Yaniv and I will roll through these questions for y'all.
All right, so first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming, and as always, having Brady run these webinars is entertaining and educational, extremely fun to hear, especially from the side. Next webinar will be in the middle of July, as Yaniv mentioned earlier, will be on the 2019 DBmaestro DevOps survey. We're going to be going over the results, going over the ramifications of what this means and the state of DevOps today, especially with regards to databases, and we hope to see everybody there. Of course, this is being recorded, and whoever attended will also be receiving a link to the recording. And like Brady said, if you have any more questions, they're willing to stay, so we hope you are.
Okay, thanks, Ben. So I see here there's a couple of questions from Kai here. And yes, I think that's a good point of caution. He says it's pretty error prone to type command syntax into commit messages, and that can be true. It's a great way to show Git in action, but a lot of people will include something like a YAML file in the file system that's a little more structured and a little easier to audit the values. That's also a good practice. It's just whichever you want to do, but the point of caution is noted there, Kai. And then there's a question on creating a throwaway replica. This is our pre-run database. So what DBmaestro does, and in the question is about Oracle. In the case of Oracle, what we're going to do is create a data pump copy of that release source environment. And the release source environment is one of your early initial environments and presumably doesn't have terabytes of data associated with it. If it is a very large database, then what we can do is clone that with just the metadata and skip the data side of it so that we can compare on the structure. But yes, it is that simple. It's just creating a clone copy of that. And then, we would do it differently for SQL Server and Postgres and stuff like that. But that's the essence of it, is we do create a scratch database, which is presumably of reasonable size so that we can mimic the existing release source environment. And then there's a final question on alter table scripts. And that is a capacity that we do have in DBmaestro, and it's what we call a build capability. So if you have differences between schema, let me jump into my HR one. If you have differences between schema, like from this sandbox environment here to that, DBmaestro can calculate those by using build. And what it'll do with build is it'll look at the latest stuff here, compare it to that, and generate a script to synchronize the two environments. And that's exactly the same engine that we use to calculate a rollback, because we're tracking not only the current state of the database, but we're tracking the state of the database through time. So every before and after of every change you've made in the system, DBmaestro tracks what the configuration was before and after. And this isn't like an expensive snapshot. We're constantly updating the DDL of each object. So whenever we take one of these snapshots, it's just a pointer to all the current object states. So it's pretty lightweight. But yeah, we can generate alter scripts. The thing that we hear that we're considering the capability of, but there's all sorts of questions around it, is that if I see a difference in Git, can I generate a file to correct that just from the text files in Git? And the answer is right now, no, because one of the things that happens is that when you check inside the database, you're always comparing real database configuration. There's no guarantee that this script in Git is something, or at least it's not as tightly coupled. But we might push the product there, and one of the reasons being is that we're going to over the next year, we're migrating DBmaestro's backend repository into Git itself. So all the files will be directly in Git. Won't even have to use a hook. It'll just be there. And so then our build engine will work on actually Git differences in the files. So you're one step ahead of us, Kai.
So Brady, that was enlightening, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your comments, Yaniv. You kept me on track and answerable to my claims.
Thanks everybody for joining us today, and pleasure to having you, and looking forward to seeing you on our next webinar. I'll be delivering that, telling you all about things that changed since our last survey, talking about where DevOps is standing today, the changes from last year, problems that people are reporting to have around the database processes, the releases, and where they spend their time, where they want to get better. And that's going to be very interesting. So looking forward to seeing all of you on that next webinar.
Great. That sounds good, Yaniv. Talk to you all soon. Bye-bye now.
Bye.